Let's talk about the book of Exodus. Now, you're probably familiar with this book because of the epic story of Moses leading Israel out of slavery from Egypt.
Yeah, but that's just the first half of the book. The second half has Moses giving the 10 Commandments to Israel, along with these blueprints for making a sacred tent. Now, right here in the middle is the story that connects these two halves together, and it all takes place at the foot of a famous mountain.
Okay, so let's start back at the beginning.
So the first thing we have to remember is we're continuing the story from Genesis.
Yeah, and Genesis will be blessed. And Genesis ends with Abraham's family down in Egypt. When Exodus begins, 400 years have passed, the family grows and becomes the people group now called Israel.
But there's this huge problem because the Israelites are enslaved to this king of the Egyptians, a guy called Pharaoh.
This guy is really bad news.
Yeah, he's horrible. He disregards their humanity, he brutally enslaves them, and he even orders that all of the Israelites' sons should be killed by throwing them into the Nile River. He wants to wipe these people out. He's the worst character in the Bible so far.
Here's where we meet an Israelite woman who wants to save her son.
And so she does throw him in the river, but safely, in this little reed basket.
And Pharaoh's daughter finds this baby and takes him as her own.
And this is the boy who grows up to become Moses, the man who will rescue Israel from slavery.
So Moses grows up, and one day, much later in his life, he has this crazy encounter with God where he comes across a bush that's on fire, but it isn't actually burning up.
And God speaks from the bush, and he appoints Moses as the man he will use to deliver Israel.
So Moses goes to Pharaoh to tell him this news that God wants his people free.
And Pharaoh, he just pretty much laughs at him. He's like, who's this God Yahweh? And in fact, he's so offended by this request, he decides to make the Israelites work even harder.
So discouraged, Moses goes back to God and says, listen, this plan's not going to work.
But God repeats his promise that he's going to rescue them. And in fact, it's right here, for the first time in the Bible, that we hear the word redemption. It literally just means to purchase a slave's freedom. But God here uses this for enslaved Israel.
And God knows Pharaoh is going to resist, so he sends 10 different plagues, one after another, like turning water into blood, sending all sorts of pests and disease. These plagues are really severe.
They are severe, but we need to understand that the story is presenting these as acts of divine justice against one of the worst oppressors in the story of the Bible. And they're all aimed at the purpose of rescuing these enslaved people and defeating the gods of Egypt.
This all comes to a climax at the 10th plague, where God's going to kill the firstborn sons across all Egypt. Every house. It's pretty rough.
It is, but it's also God's response for how Pharaoh killed the Israelite sons.
Now as you turn the page, you suddenly get 2 long chapters of detailed instructions for what's essentially throwing a dinner party with a recipe for a lamb.
Yeah, but this lamb is super important. God tells the Israelites to pick it out and to prepare it to be eaten. And they're supposed to take its blood and then paint it all over the doorframe of their house. And anyone who is in that house will be spared from this final plague.
And God knows Pharaoh
And so this
is going to
meal
resist, so he
is called
sends 10
Passover. It
different
commemorates
plagues,
this
one
key
after
moment in
another,
the story
like
where
turning
God
water
brings
into
his
blood,
justice on
sending all
human
sorts
evil,
of pests and
but also
disease.
shows mercy
These plagues
by
are
providing
really
this
severe.
substitute. They
This
are
final
severe,
plague
but
makes
we need to
Pharaoh
understand that the
angry.
story
He
is
demands that
presenting these
Israel
as acts
gets
of
out of
divine
Egypt,
justice
which is great.
against one
But
of the
sudnly,
worst
as they leave,
oppressors in the
Pharaoh
story
changes
of
his
the Bible.
mind. He has
And
a
they're all
change of heart.
aimed but on top of
purpose
that,
of
we're also
rescuing
told
these
that
enslaved
God
people
hardens
and
Pharaoh.
defeating the gods. Why would this all God
come
do
to
a
that?
climax at
Well,
the
what we need
10th
to remember is that over and
where
over in the
God's going to
story,
kill the
Pharaoh has
firstborn
already
sons
chosen to harden
across
his own
every
heart.
house.
So at this point, Pharaoh, he's not just
also
evil,
God's
he's become monstrous. Pharaoh killed even his own
where they were
advisors.
and
think
what
that's
they were
true.
doing, in just the same way
And
as
so
we're
how is
seeing
God
Russian
supposed to
conscripts
deal
now
with such
confused
extreme
and
instructions?
bemused about
That's
how
exactly
they
what
ended up in
this
captivity in
is that
Ukraine.
God uses his
So
power
putting all of that
to
together,
this
you have to
lamb.
wonder,
His
well,
army
Take it
are
out.
destroyed in the Red Sea as Israel passes
And
into
they're supposed
freedom.
to take it. And after this, we find the very first song of worship in the Bible, as the people praise God for anyone who is in that house. And it's in this story that the word salvation is also used. So this meal, which means simply to be rescued, it commemorates this key
Now that they're
moment in the
saved,
story
you would
where
think
God
that
wants
everything
his
should be
justice
great,
on
but
human
the
evil,
story quickly
but also
turns.
shows
The Israelites start wandering in the desert. They're tired, hungry, lost. And you start to wonder, what's God doing? What were they saved for?
And we learn the answer to that question in the very next story, which ties the two parts of this whole book together.
Hi, this is Tim.
And this is John.
We think one of the best ways to understand the Bible is to look at the design and message of each individual book and how it fits into the overall storyline of the whole Bible.
We also make videos that take one theme and trace it through the entire storyline of the Bible from beginning to end.
Hey, we want you to meet some of the artists who are working on these videos.
We're continuing the story from Genesis.
Yeah, in Genesis, God promised Abraham that through his family, all the nations